Hello. This presentation is intended to serve two purposes. The first purpose is to go over the guidelines for race committee, but also as a printout, it will serve as a user guide for race committee on the race committee boat, should they need to look up something quick to figure out how to implement a change, whether it be a postponement, recall, individual, general, and so on. So with that, we're going to start right in. Here's the table of contents. As you can see, if there's a specific task that the committee wants to go to, individual recall is on page 16. It'll summarize what you need to do, flag sequences, and sound signals. So a copy of this should be on the race committee boat and available to everybody to review as they're doing race committee, either on the way out or prepped prior to their assigned race committee duty. We're going to start with the goals of the race committee. One of the themes that I always run with these presentations is the goal of the race committee is to set up and run a fair race. The most important thing the committee can do is make sure that all the competitors on the race course are treated equitably. And that would mean setting up a square course, letting the racers know what's going on. And most importantly, if you make a mistake as race committee, it's very easy to fix. Most problems can be resolved by either going into a general recall or a postponement and then correcting the problem. We'll talk about when you would use each one of those later down in the presentation. Running a fair race, a little more detail. So a square course, why is a square starting line so important? On a square course, and we'll talk about what that means when we talk about the courses, each position on the starting line is basically equidistant from the first mark. So no matter where you start on the line, you're not at a disadvantage. In addition, it reduces crowding at the race committee boat or at the pin. When one side of the line is favored for something other than a tactical reason, everybody's going to crowd up on one of those ends, and that's when you start running into protests, collisions, and closed sailing, because 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 boats are all trying to get to the same spot at the same time. So a square line is the race committee's best friend. Why do we do windward lewards? The reason why we do windward leeward courses is our perf ratings are based on a boat's upwind and downwind sailing performance. Reaching in that scenario doesn't really work. And the fact is that most boats with similar waterline lengths will reach at the same speed, assuming they have the same sail plan. The easiest and most obvious example of this is a J30 and a J29. Both boats below the water are basically identical. We have slightly different sail plans, but when we reach next to each other, the boats go at the same speed because we're pushing the same waterline length. So if you add a race and you start adding reaching courses, all the boats that you owe time to or time is owed to you, it doesn't work in the handicap rating because you're not allowing the boat's performance dictate how the race is run. And again, boats' performance are based on upwind and downwind sailing. Communicate your intentions. It's always a good idea to let the racers know what you're planning on doing. Now, there's a limit to what you can do on the communications. Most of it would be come within hail. If you change a race course, there's a come within hail flag that can be flown. That should indicate to the racers that you changed something that was originally posted. They should come over to the race committee boat and take a look. You could get on the radio and say, we're making changes, please come by. I strongly encourage using flags rather than radio communications. It reduces the confusion. Next one, if you make a mistake, fix it. You can, as we said earlier, you can solve most problems with a postponement or a general recall. Don't be afraid to do those things. A competitor would much rather have the race run a few minutes later than just running a race that's bad, whether it be a pin set free and is drifting, a significant wind shift has occurred, and the course is no longer square. Take the time to get it right. It's just as easy to do it right as it is to do it wrong. General guidelines. Plan to have at least 3 committee members. 4 or more is recommended. Avoid using government marks for a pin end of the line, especially big ones. This is critical. A lot of people will use a government mark for the pin end, and if it's something other than a can, like a rock pile or a lighthouse, boats that are running down the pin, if they get into trouble, they have less distance to move and avoid the pin. If it's an inflatable, it bounces off. If it's the lighthouse or a can, it's not going to be as forgiving. If one of the RYC predefined marks doesn't line up for a square course, you may just need to drop the mobile. R1 and R2 are not the only upwind marks we can use, and sometimes you can't run a race to R1 or R2 from T. You need to put a mark in the middle. The pin end should always be on the port side of the committee boat. The course board should always display it on the starboard side of the race committee boat. Radio communications from racers should be kept to a minimum. A lot of time racers get on, ask questions. When you start answering those questions over the radio, you can confuse some of the other competitors. You can always either ask them to come by the committee boat to resolve their question, but try to avoid extensive radio communications with the competitors. The starting line should be long enough for all boats to fit on the line, plus 25 or 30%. If you make the line too small, you're going to start running into the same problem as a line that's not square, where boats are piling up on the committee boat or piling up at the pin, again, causing boats to be sailing closer together than necessary and increasing the possibility for collisions and protests. Starting line should always be square to the wind, which is basically plus or minus 90 degrees from the upwind wind direction. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about courses and square lines once we get into the courses. How to set up a race course. So the best way is to get out on the water early. The earlier you're out on the water, overseeing what's going on, the better, the more time you have to get things set up. Go to the general area on the bay where you want to set your course. Figure out if you can use one of the RYC defined marks for the weather mark. If you can't, use the mobile mark when needed. Choose a location where the area where the wind is steady. Do a wind check, basically stop the race committee boat, face upwind, and stop means the boat's not moving, it's drifting. Once the race committee is no longer making way, you can use a wind vane, hand bearing compass, regular compass, just to basically determine the wind direction. Write this number down, and for the examples we're going to use today, we're going to say the wind's coming out of the east at 90 degrees. Then the turning mark in the starting line would be roughly in nautical miles at 270 degrees west. So basically dead downwind would be due west. Picking a government mark or dropping a mobile mark in place where you have enough space and navigable waters and there's enough breeze for the boats to sail. If all the boats that are trying to race can't make way against the current, then you can't start the race. Also, try to avoid obstructions. Frequently, we start races at the lower end of the bay, near Z or F or Y, and there's barges moored in the area. They create additional challenges, not necessarily something you can always avoid, but be cognizant of what's in the area just below the starting line and off the starting line. From the weather mark, the best thing to do is drive the race committee boat. Again, our example is winds coming at 90 out of the east. Drive the race committee boat 270 degrees, the distance you want to have the course set up for. And at that point, you can drop your pin and square your line. If you have a tablet, what I tend to do is I drop a pin where I set the mark, and then I use the calipers to go down 270 degrees, the distance I want. I drop another pin, and I go to that point and set up the line. This was basically defining your race and starting area. Courses. We have a variety of courses we can set for windward leeward courses. This one is the standard one that we sail most races. You're basically setting it up with an even number of legs. Works for wind in any kind of direction. Race committee boat stays on station. The pin should be dropped, so it will be at the port end of the line. The race committee boat should always set up on the starboard side of the line. Again, that's so that if boats are running down the line on starboard, they don't have to try to avoid the race committee boat if they are too early. It's much easier to hit an inflatable or miss an inflatable than a 26-foot race committee boat. Drop the anchor at the appropriate distance from the pin that you just dropped, and let the scope out until it reads 0. So in this case, the weather pin is on the east. The weather mark is on the east. The pin is north. Committee boat is south, and the downwind leg is west. Another course that can be done is a windward leeward with upwind finish. Windward leeward course is an odd number of legs. It's best when the wind is bearing out of the west, southwest, or west. Basically, what this does is brings the finish of the race closer to the yacht club, so there's not as much time wasted sailing into the club. Also, as the season goes on and we lose daylight, it's quicker, gets the race over faster. The disadvantage is it's unfair to boats that don't sail as well upwind as they do downwind. So you are impacting the fleet a little bit, but it's not an uncommon thing to do to have an upwind finish. To do this, the race committee boat anchors off the starboard of the weather mark. Again, it should be a bearing of 0, not much different than it would be if it was at the starting pin. The accuracy of that is not nearly as critical as the start. A modified windward leeward. This is actually my favorite course. The committee boat doesn't have to move. It's good for all wind directions. It's a little bit more challenging to set up because you have 3 items that need to be lined up: your weather mark, your turning mark, and the starting line all have to be lined up and square. What this does is it gives the race committee a great view of the race. Your boats will be sailing through the starting line as they're racing and going up and back. For the competitors, it gives them an extra turning mark at the bottom, forces their crew work to be on point for 2 leeward mark roundings as opposed to just 1. Again, a little harder to set up, but more challenging and more enjoyable for the committee. So let's talk about when a course isn't square. So here in this example, instead of the course being set at 90, it's set more like 180 or 75. So all of the boats in a course that's set up like this are going to, again, be crowded up at the race committee boat because they're going to be sailing on starboard. That's going to be the favored tack. So the higher you are on starboard tack, the more advantage you have over the boats that are to leeward of you. Another indication and downfall of this is when boats go around the weather mark, they're not going to be going on a dead downwind leg. They're going to be reaching back. So the best way the race committee can determine whether or not they set a good course is if boats are jibing to come back. If you don't see boats jibing coming downwind, then you didn't set a good course. Here's another example of an unsquare course where the committee boat is favored. And again, you're going to see all the boats trying to get up to the race committee boat, because in this example, the weather mark is closer to the race committee boat as opposed to the pin end. And here's an example of a port tack start where it's skewed, but this time it's skewed on the port side. And if you notice, the starboard tack boats will struggle to cross the line. That's another good indication as to whether or not you have a square line. Boats on either port or starboard should be able to cross the starting line and not sailing parallel to the starting line. So there are a lot of visual things you can use as the race committee before you start a race to see if things are set up appropriately. Preparing for the start. After the course is set, check in all the competing boats, verify the class, their sail numbers. On a scratch sheet, write down the course, the distance, direction, and strength of the wind, bearing to the first mark, tide, direction, and strength, day and time of the start. Now, rarely do we get all this information, and 9 times out of 10, it's not needed. But when you have a protest and people are challenging what was going on at a start, having this information available to the protest committee and the race committee is valuable, because it will help set things in motion and determine, what way the boats are reacting. Another thing to do is anticipate what's going to go on based on the wind conditions and the way the tide is flowing, the current's going. So for example, if the wind is blowing from the west and the tide is flooding, that means you have boats that are going to be being pulled over the line. So it's quite possible, or more likely, that you'll have boats over early because the current is bringing them over the starting line. So any boat that's early is going to have to dump speed. Once they dump speed, the current will then start taking them over the starting line. If the starting line isn't square, you're going to get a lot of activity at either the race committee boat or at the pin. Again, just things to anticipate and think about as you're setting things up on the race course. Okay, so now we're going to get into the actual starting sequence. I have 2 slides on starting sequence. This one basically uses a clock dial and a description of what's going on. The next one actually shows the flags and the horns as well. So for the first start, a minute before the first signal, the best thing is to do a series of 5 horns. This will indicate to the racers that you plan on going into sequence in 1 minute. There's a sound system on the committee boat that's programmed for rolling starts. I don't know how often that's used, but if it's there, it will be set up and go automatically once you start it. If not, you can replicate that with a basic air horn on the committee boat. So for the first sequence, we're going to assume that the B fleet is starting first. So at their first sound signal, the B flag goes up with 1 horn. At this point, only the class flag is up, and the B fleet has 5 minutes to start. A minute later, the prep flag goes up, P flags raised with 1 horn. So now you have both the class flag and P flag flying. Now the B fleet has 4 minutes to start. 3 minutes later, the prep flag comes down. At that point, you have, with 1 horn, you'll have the class flag up. B fleet has 1 minute to start. And then finally, when that 1 minute passes, the B fleet, the A fleet's flag goes up, or the next class flag goes up. The B fleet starts. The A fleet has 5 minutes to start. If you decide that you don't want to do rolling starts and you want to put a gap in there, then you would go to the beginning again, and when you're ready to do the 1 minute or 5 minute start again, I would recommend doing a series of 5 horns and then going into the starting sequence again. Here's a pictorial type of view as to what's going on. 5 minutes, the B class flag goes up, there's one horn. 4 minutes to go, 1 minute later, prep flag goes up with a horn. 3 minutes later, prep flag comes down with a horn. A minute later, B flag comes down, A flag goes up with a horn. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the conditions where the race committee may have to fly some additional flags based on what's occurred at the start. So for an individual recall, it's basically the X flag, white with a blue cross. As soon as the boats are identified that are over, the horn should go off and the X flag should go up. The X flag stays up until all boats have come back and restarted, or there's only 1 minute left for the next starting sequence. So boats only have 4 minutes to be notified to come back. So once the prep flag comes down for the next start, so does the X flag. General recall. When do you do a general recall, which is always the question. If the race committee cannot identify all the boats that are over early, it's a general recall. There's no magical number that says if 4, 5, 6, 7 boats are over early, you do a general recall. It's at the race committee's discretion, but if they can identify the boats that are over early, then you should not do a general recall, you should do an individual recall. If you can't identify all the boats that are over early, that's when you would do a general recall. After a general recall, you go back into sequence, but the class that was recalled goes to the end of the line. The next class gets started after this. All right, so what do you do after you start a race or something went wrong in the starting sequence? Again, the purpose is to be fair, make everything equitable. If you're off on a flag, you're off on your timing, the easiest thing to do is go into a postponement. Two horns, postponement flag goes up. Get on the radio, address the situation. We're off on our timing. We're off on our flags. We're going to go into a brief postponement. Once the postponement flag comes down, the first signal would be 1 minute later. Abandoning procedures. There are a number of reasons why you would abandon a race, and there's 3 different abandonment setups. The first one is all races are abandoned, return to the starting area. Why would you do this? You would do this when, after the start of the race, either all the wind dropped out and it was no longer fair because boats are now drifting out. You could also do this if there's a significant wind shift and the course is so unfair that it's not worth racing. And let's see, or if there was a mistake made that the committee didn't realize at the start of the race. The next one is all races are abandoned, further signals to be made ashore. That could be the wind has just dropped out and there's no wind. There could be a potential hazard coming, whether it be weather, and you want to get everybody off the race course and plan on going back out if you can. Not likely for a Wednesday night, but for a weekend event, quite possibly could happen. And then finally, all races are abandoned, no more racing today. This would also be used in the event of a storm. If a storm's coming in, the race committee sees it, they decide they don't want to run races, they want to cancel what's already been started. This would be the sound signal to go off. Likely the boats racing won't hear it. On the radio on this is probably not a bad idea. But the racers will figure it out when the race committee boat's gone. So there's not much you can do about it once the boats have started. Okay. Finishing. Finishing a race is actually harder than starting the race because you're going to have a lot of things going on all at one time. If you set up course B, where the weather mark should be on the port side of the committee boat, windward leeward race for the competitors, they're thinking all marks to port, so get on station early, which means you're moving the committee boat to get up there. The finish line should be square, just like the starting line. Not as important as the starting line, but it should try to make it as close as possible. When you're actually taking finish times, you want to have every boat that crossed the line no matter what. So even if the boat was over early and they didn't go back, don't give them a horn, but document what time they finished. This can be useful if your timing is off on some of the recording of other boats finishing. So it gives you a perspective of the boats that were finishing and in what order, and it makes it easier to go back and try and rectify any kind of scoring problems that you may have made. You should always have 2 people writing down boat names along with their finish times. If possible, it's a good idea to actually record it so that you can go back and correct any errors that may have occurred. And it happens when we get 4 or 5 boats finishing at one time. It's not necessarily easy to figure it all out. You know, which boat, what class, and what time. I always recommend that before boats start finishing, that you fill out one of the sheets that has the skipper's name, sail number, rating, as much information as you can. Obviously, that can be a good place to write down the course, the wind, the current direction. So it's all contained on one document. Calculating the results. There's a number of ways that people do it. What I would recommend is the first boat to finish gets an elapsed time of 1 hour, 360 seconds. The reason why we do this, it just makes the numbers easier for calculating and setting up the formulas. So in this particular example, the first boat to finish over the line was Sold. He has a rating of 114. The next boat to finish over the line is Spiny. And then the third boat to finish is Bad Cow. And then finally Burnt Jay. So those are the actual elapsed times, which then get calculated into the elapsed time in seconds. You have your allowance calculated, which is the distance times the rating. And then the corrected time is really the elapsed time minus the time allowance, and then the smallest time allowance wins. So if you look in this example, the winning boat was Sold, second place boat was Spiny, third was Bad Cow, and fourth was Burnt Jay. So there are sheets on the committee boat that can be used to calculate the results. You can also see up top all the information we talked about earlier: date, series, what the division is, what time the guns went off, the course, distance, wind speed, wind direction. Also, a lot of this information will be populated into a spreadsheet and or a racing form that calculates it. So the more you have information down, the easier it is to just double check all the paperwork. Okay, down to the appendices. So the last rule change, there was a rule change made for sport boats. So basically, it's no longer the first part of your boat that crosses the line is over or finishes. It's actually the first part of the hull. So it's no longer letting a sail out, or, you know, the sprit boats worrying about, you know, being over early because they have a bowsprit sticking out. It's just the hull. It's the and last but not least, there are just some questions to go over that we talked about previously. Why windward leeward courses? Again, that's because our PHRF ratings are based on the boat's performance, which is upwind performance and downwind performance, since reaching is usually a non Non-performance event, it's straight line sailing. Do the number of legs matter? The number of legs of the course do matter. You want to make sure you have an even number of upwinds and downwinds, but that's not always appropriate, and shortening it or having an upwind finish is not a bad thing. There are times when it makes sense, you do it. Why should the pin always be on the leeward end of the line? Again, that's because a boat's running down the line. You don't want to give them an obstruction that could damage their boat or require drastic alterations of course. So the smaller the pin end is, the better. What should be taken into account when you're setting up a race course? Wind speed. You know, if it's light air, you don't want to send people out to L, which is a 6-mile race. If you have, good breeze, you can have a longer leg. Current, if it's light air and the boats are going to be going downwind against the current, they're going to be struggling. Time of year, how much daylight do you have left? And the one last thing to take into account is the length of an upwind leg. Picking a course where you have an upwind leg that's a half a mile or 0.6 of a mile, that is also a risky type of a race course, even if you're going to make it 6 legs or more. Yes, you're getting the length of the course in there, but you are making a lot of mark roundings in congested areas because all the boats will be going around those marks together. So food for thought, not a requirement, but obviously giving a little bit more than a half a mile leg is always optimal. That's all the presentation for today. Please feel free to email me, or if you have any questions or any corrections in what's been presented, and we'll make those updates to the PowerPoint and to this session as well. Thank you and good luck.